Tyler Warren out of Penn State would be a very popular selection if the Jets chose him in next week's NFL draft. But there are 4 reasons the Jets should not pick him 7th overall. We'll go into them today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Thursday, April 17th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listener, first watch every day. Big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. And today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Well, today we are talking about Tyler Warren out of Penn State. He is a tight end, and he is going to go very high in next week's NFL draft. There have been a lot of rumors. There's been a lot of buzz that the Jets could pick him 7th overall. So we're going to go into detail breaking down Tyler Warren today. We're going to talk about how he could fit the Jets roster. We're going to talk about some things that might make him a more difficult projection going from college to the NFL than you may think. But we're going to start by talking about 4 reasons why the Jets should not pick him 7th overall. And this is going to be very controversial, I know, because Tyler Warren is getting a lot of buzz in the Jets fan base. He's getting a lot of love in the Jets fan base. Lots of fans want to take him 7th overall. And one caveat I always throw out there whenever I say something that is somewhat critical of a prospect is I'm not suggesting that Tyler Warren is doomed to be a bad NFL player. In fact, as we're going to discuss in a bit, I think the odds are quite high that he's going to be a good player in the NFL. It's a question of whether or not the Jets should draft him 7th overall. And I think the answer to that is no. Well, why do I feel that way? I'll give you 4 reasons right now. Number 1 is I have big concerns with Tyler Warren that NFL teams are kind of chasing the past. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you saw what Brock Bowers did this year with the Raiders as a rookie, I mean, he really lit it up. I mean, he looks like a game-changing talent at the tight end position. So I think that there are going to be a lot of teams that look at what happened with Bowers and the Raiders, and they say, oh, we got to get our own Brock Bowers. We got to get our own dynamic tight end. And that's great. Look, if you can get another Brock Bowers, that's a wonderful thing. Here's the challenge, though. Tyler Warren is not in Brock Bowers' league as a prospect. If you compare what Brock Bowers was a year ago with what Tyler Warren is now, the two they're really not on the same level. Why do I say that? Well, Tyler Warren really only broke out his 5th year at Penn State. In fact, I mean, here's a crazy stat for you. If you combine Tyler Warren's production, his first 4 years at Penn State, year 1 through year 4, he had less receptions and less receiving yards than Brock Bowers had as an 18-year-old freshman at Georgia. It was really only in Warren's final season at Penn State that he started to produce. And they put up big numbers, 104 catches, 1,233 yards, and 8 touchdowns. But prior to that, he did very little. Only had 49 catches over his first 4 years at Penn State. And I think that the statistics really spiked for a reason. We're going to get to that in a little bit. But Brock Bowers was the best player on the field at points for Georgia as an 18-year-old. He was going up against guys who were older than him, and he was playing at a really high level. You know, if you have a rookie going out there and dominating against 3rd and 4th year players, you got to feel good about the rookie because the rookie's got a lot of room to grow. That's true in the NFL, but it's also true in college football. And Brock Bowers was the leading receiver on a Georgia team, which had a guy in Ladd McConkey. It had another receiver in Ladd McConkey who was an 1,100-yard receiver in the NFL. So that speaks volumes about how good Brock Bowers was at Georgia. A year ago, I expressed a lot of concerns about Bowers that were really position-based. And even if you go listen to that, when I was a little skeptical of drafting Bowers, I mentioned, he's a great prospect. My concerns were just really about drafting a tight end. I think Warren's a good prospect. I don't think he's on Bowers' level, though. And even though I had concerns about drafting Bowers potentially, I at least understood the argument for it because he was such an exceptional prospect at the tight end position. I think Warren's a good prospect. I don't think he's a prospect who's worth 7th overall, though. And I think if you look at what he did in college, it's just not in the same league as what Brock Bowers did. That brings me to my second point. I think that Warren might be getting a little overhyped because of how many different roles people think he can play in an offense. Because you hear about him, you see him, you say, well, he can line up in line at tight end, he can be an H-back, he can line up in the backfield, you can put him in the tight slot, you can put him in the regular slot, you can put him out wide, he can even play wildcat quarterback. And that's great, but how much does that really move the needle? I mean, I guess it helps to a certain extent, but I don't think it helps to an extent that's that great. I mean, first of all, like wildcat quarterback, is that really anything that makes a big difference on your team? Under normal circumstances, no. And certainly not with the Jets having Justin Fields at quarterback. The Jets have no purpose running wildcat this year because they have a quarterback who's going to be effective on design runs anyway. So they don't need to put in a new quarterback. They don't even need to replace him to incorporate the quarterback into the run game. And the other stuff is fine, but it really, I mean, is a prospect really better because he stands in a ton of spots before the snap? There was one play where Warren had a nice touchdown catch against USC where he got a touchdown pass when he lined up at center on the play. How did that happen? Well, it was Penn State ran an unbalanced line. So he was essentially the guy, even though he was snapping the ball, he was the guy at the end of the line of scrimmage, which made him an eligible receiver. And he snapped the ball to Drew Aller, and Penn State, he ended up scoring a touchdown on that play, which is fun, but that doesn't mean like he could play center normally. I think we get a little bit carried away when we talk about how much versatility matters. I think we get a little carried away when we talk about how much lining up in different spots really adds to your versatility. But I do think that's another thing that's at play for Tyler Warren. The third issue I have is a lot of the discussion around Warren seems to be based on need. And look, the Jets tight end position is not good right now. It's very difficult for me to remember in my 30 plus years of watching the Jets any time where the tight end position has been good. I mean, maybe a couple of years with Dustin Keller. At best, it's been passable. And right now, I mean, who do you have? I mean, I guess Jeremy Ruckert is your number one tight end. And, Jeremy Ruckert might be the worst number one tight end in the league. Jeremy Ruckert hasn't shown he can be a competent number two tight end, much less a number one tight end. So I am sympathetic to the idea that the Jets have a need at the tight end position. The thing is, they also have other needs, and these other needs are more significant. They have a need at wide receiver. They have a need at right tackle. You can make an argument they have a need at defensive tackle because after Quinn and Williams, there's not a whole lot there. There are needs at other spots, and those other needs are more important. I mean, I don't think there's ever been a team in the NFL that's been bad because their tight end wasn't good enough. Yeah, great tight end makes a difference, but being bad at tight end doesn't sink your team. There's no team out there that's bad because their tight ends aren't good enough. There are teams that are bad out there bad because their offensive line's not good enough. There are teams that are bad because their quarterback isn't good enough. There are teams that are bad because their wide receivers aren't good enough. Very few teams out there where you look at it, you say they're bad, and tight end's the number one place you look. Tight end, it's great to have a difference maker, but it's not a spot where having a need is really something that sinks your team. And the fourth issue I have with Warren is I feel like with him, there's a lot of box score scouting going on, because I gave you the numbers, 104 receptions, 1,233 yards, 8 touchdowns this past season. He added another 218 yards on the ground and 4 touchdowns as a rusher. So, a phenomenal season. But numbers only mean so much. Brock Bowers posted numbers, and it was a sign of, how he could project to the NFL. I'm not quite sure Tyler Warren's numbers are as projectable. As we continue here on this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets, I'm going to go deeper into that. I think Tyler Warren's actually a much more difficult player to project to the NFL than a lot of analysts would say. And that goes back to his college film because the way he got his production is not really all that repeatable in the NFL. So there's going to be a lot more projection on Warren than people realize. And I'll explain why I say that as we continue here on this Thursday edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Gametime. There's nothing like the atmosphere of an NBA playoff game. Every bucket, every defensive stop, every moment feels huge. It's electric in the arena, and with Gametime, you can be part of it without the stress of last-minute ticket hunting. Because Gametime makes it fast and easy to get playoff tickets, even when demand is sky high. Prices on the app actually go down the closer we get to tip-off, and their last-minute deals can save you up to 60%, but not just for the NBA playoffs. Anything you could want to go to. You want to go to a baseball game, you want to go to a concert, you want to go see comedy, you want to go to the theater. Gametime's the place to get in on the action. You can save up to 60% off buying last-minute tickets for no matter what you're heading to. And the all-in pricing means there's no surprise. All-in pricing means there's no surprise fees at checkout. What you see is what you pay. I use Gametime myself. I mean, I love that all-in pricing. There are no hidden fees. And I also love that you get the view from your seat. They show you a picture of what it's going to look like at your venue before you arrive, so no surprises, no obstructed views that you weren't expecting. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL. LOCKEDONNFL, one word, no space, for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. Big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Today, Tyler Warren is our focus. He's a tight end out of Penn State, expected to go very high in next week's NFL draft. And a guy who has gotten a lot of buzz as a potential option for the New York Jets with the 7th overall pick. And I dare say, very popular option among wide portions of the fan base. In fact, I feel like I'm saying some controversial stuff today when I say I don't think I would pick him if I were the Jets at 7th overall. And none of this should be misconstrued to mean that I think Tyler Warren is a bad prospect, because I will tell you that watching him play, I would be kind of surprised if he wasn't a good player in the NFL. My question, though, is will he be a great player in the NFL? Because we're talking about the 7th overall pick here. We're not talking about a pick in round 2 or round 3. And, as I mentioned in the last segment, he was very productive if you look at the stat sheet last year. And look, I mean, he caught passes that were thrown to him. There's no question. My question, though, is how repeatable last year's production was. Because, yes, he did have 104 catches. He did have 1,233 yards and 8 touchdowns. But what he was doing, I don't know for the most part whether it was that repeatable once he reaches the NFL. Because when you watch him on the film, it's mostly not a case of him beating coverages. You see a lot of screens thrown his way. You see a lot of shovel passes to him. You see a lot of routes that he runs to the flat, and they're pretty much just designed to get him the ball in that area. And, look, he did a lot of damage with those plays. These were clearly designed touches for him. Penn State wanted to get the ball in their best player's hands frequently. The fact he was their best player, the fact that, they drew so much up for him is obviously a positive. But, once he reaches the NFL, it's not, those things aren't going to happen anymore. He's not going to have 104 catches because his team's force feeding him the ball. In college, sometimes if you're like the best player on your team by a lot, you just see bulk in that. You just see the bulk of targets to that extent. Again, like I didn't see a lot of instances where Warren was like beating a guy one-on-one. Now, there are a couple things I'll say. Number one, if you look at him in contested catch situations, he looked good. He was able to. I think it was as much as anything, he's able to concentrate. If he's in traffic, he keeps his focus on the ball. It's not necessarily that he's the greatest leaper in the world. But he sees where the ball is, and he goes and gets the ball. And that's a really positive, especially for a tight end. Tight ends tend to be bigger targets. They tend to be guys you look for in the red zone when the space is constricted. That's a real positive. He was very good in those situations, and I think that's transferable to the NFL. I also do see some signs that he could be an effective route runner in the NFL, particularly in the slot. I think for a guy of his size, he's a bigger guy. And bigger guys typically struggle with lateral agility. It's difficult to explode, for the bigger guys. The smaller guys have an easier time just with short area quickness, breaking either left or right. But there were instances where he played the slot, and he was up against the slot corner. And he was able to create a lot of separation because he sold his route. Maybe he sold going left and then broke right, or sold going right and broke left, and was able to get open. And that's a real positive thing, particularly in today's NFL. Your tight ends, and this goes back to something I said in the first segment, where people talk about how all the spots he lines up in. Most tight ends line up all over the place in today's NFL. If you're a tight end, you're probably going to see a decent share of snaps in the slot. And he looked like a pretty good route runner out of the slot in instances where he, I don't think Penn State gave him like a full route tree for the most part, but there were instances where, he'd have to run like a pivot route or he'd have to run an option route. I thought he did pretty good with those. And I didn't see it a ton, but in the few times he was called upon, he looked good. And you feel like if he starts practicing that more, that's a skill he'll start to master. So again, that's another positive thing. I think, if you watched him, it was clear that after the catch, he was very good. Guy with, again, that change of direction ability came into play. He was able to make guys miss, make a guy miss a tackle. He also is a bigger guy, so he can run with some degree of power. So these are all things that are obviously very helpful. And while he did not look like a burner on the field, his time speed was good. So I don't think he's slow. He broke the 4.7 in the 40-yard dash, which is quite good for a tight end. I don't think he was a guy who was running away from anybody on deep routes, but I think you could say he's not slow. And these are the things that tell me that the odds are good that Warren's going to be a good tight end. I'm not when I say I don't think the Jets should pick him at 7. You can think a guy's going to be a good player in the NFL and say, I wouldn't pick him at 7. And that's kind of where I'm at with Tyler Warren, because we saw so infrequently the attributes. We saw him so infrequently asked to do things that he'll have to do to have success in the NFL. So the question becomes this: is he just going to be good at them, or is he going to be great at them? And based on the limited number of times we saw him do these things, I think that's an impossible answer to question. Not a possible question to answer, not an impossible answer to question. But when you're talking about the 7th overall pick, it's got to be a guy who is a big impact player. It has to be a guy who's a dynamic player. A guy who's just a good tight end, I don't know that's really worth the 7th overall pick, because 7th overall pick, you're looking for a guy who's going to be a pretty consistent 1,000-yard receiver. And last year in the NFL, there were 21 wide receivers with 1,000 yards and only 3 tight ends with 1,000 yards. So if you're going to be worth it at 7, you have to be like one of the absolute elite tight ends in the league. And yeah, look, Warren's statistics were great, but the stuff that he would need to do in the NFL to produce similar stats were things he was not asked to do all that much. And I think he's got the skills to do them effectively, but does he have the skills? There's a difference between doing it effectively and doing it great. There's a difference between being solid and being at the top of the league. A solid tight end is worth having, but a solid tight end's not worth drafting 7th overall. And I think you have to come at one of the things I've learned is you have to come at the draft with a degree of humility. You can't definitively say that one guy is going to be great and another guy's not. You just kind of have to look at the evidence, and you have to come up with odds. What's the most likely scenario? What are the odds this guy's a top of the league player? What are the odds he's not? I don't love the idea of I've come to really dislike the idea of a player having a ceiling and then having a floor, because in theory, any player could be a 0 and any player could be great. But I do think you can kind of start to estimate what are the odds this player is going to hit the highest ceiling, what are the odds he's going to hit the highest floor. And I don't know that I have great odds of Tyler Warren being a completely dynamic player. It could happen. And if it happens, look, if he is one of the top 3 tight ends, he's worth the 7th overall pick. But looking at him now, looking at the film, looking at what we know, I can't say I feel overwhelmingly confident to the extent I'd want to bet the 7th overall pick. Now, if we're talking later on in the draft, and I'm not talking day 3, I'm talking maybe early day 2, would I feel comfortable in drafting Tyler Warren? Is there enough there that makes me feel like he's a good bet to make good on the value of one of those picks? Absolutely. 7th overall, that's different though. You're on the Locked On Jets podcast. We'll talk about what happens if the Jets disagree with me and the Jets do draft Warren 7th overall. If you're a longtime listener to the podcast, the Jets never listen to me, so it's entirely possible they will draft Warren. And I think expectations as a rookie would have to be big. How big? Well, I'll explain and tell you why as we continue here on this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by LinkedIn. As a small business owner, your work does not end when the clock hits 5. Your business is always on your mind, which means when it's time to hire, you need a partner that works just as hard as you do. That's where LinkedIn Jobs comes in. When you clock out, LinkedIn clocks in. LinkedIn makes it easy to post your job for free, share it with your network, and get qualified candidates all in one place. Of course, the Jets have a scouting department to find the prospects for the team The Jets have guys working around the clock to identify whether Tyler Warren's a great prospect, whether some of the other guys they could pick are the right prospects for the team. Well, you can use LinkedIn as your scouting department. You post your job. LinkedIn's new feature helps you write job descriptions, and then quickly get your job in front of the right people with deep candidate insights. And here's a pro tip. Add the hashtag hiring frame to your profile picture to double your reach to qualified candidates. No wonder 72% of small businesses say LinkedIn helps them find high quality hires. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnfl to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. The Locked On Jets podcast here on this Thursday. We are talking about tight end Tyler Warren out of Penn State, a guy who very much could be in play for the New York Jets at the 7th overall selection in next week's NFL draft. Now, I've laid out why, while I like Tyler Warren, I don't think he should be the guy the Jets choose at 7th overall. But if you're a longtime listener to the podcast, I don't need to tell you the Jets never listen to my advice. So it's very possible that the Jets could end up drafting Tyler Warren in the top 10. And if that's the case, what should expectations be? What would his role be with the New York Jets in 2025? And I think that this is pretty clear. I mean, obviously he's going to be the starting tight end if they draft him 7th overall, because unless you have a good reason, otherwise a guy you draft in the top 10 is a starter day one immediately. I mean, unless it's kind of like a more of a luxury pick where you already feel good about what you have at a given position, or unless the guy's just like a total project and he just has like such extreme physical tools that you feel like you can't pass on him even though he's not ready. Normally a guy you draft that high is going to be in the starting lineup right off the bat. And for the Jets right now, I mean, if the season began today, Jeremy Ruckert's probably your starting tight end, and Jeremy Ruckert's probably not going to provide a whole lot, unless there's like some major improvement. I mean, unless like he's been able to clear his head this offseason, maybe the new coaching staff can get through to him in a way the previous coaching staff could not. Very difficult to expect much in the way of production from Jeremy Ruckert. And Warren could certainly help. I do think Warren is a pretty good blocker. We haven't discussed his blocking skills yet because, like, if we're talking about a tight end you're drafting in the top 10, it's not, blocking skills don't matter. I mean, if we're being honest, you're not going to draft a tight end in the top 10 based on his blocking skills. Today's NFL, more than anything, what you're looking for out of the tight end position is receiving skills. But that said, Warren, I think, is a pretty good blocker. I think, he's a guy who probably could help year one a little bit as a blocker to the extent a tight end really matters in the run game. I do think he's pretty good there. The way Ruckert is, and I think Ruckert is more of like a highlight reel guy. You'll see like these clips like pop up on social media of Ruckert throwing an amazing block, which he does. But the thing with Ruckert is that for every amazing block he has, there are two where he just completely whiffs. So when Ruckert latches onto somebody, it looks really impressive, but he doesn't use consistent technique. And I think he struggles as a blocker, despite like the real highlight reel blocks. I think Warren can step in and help you as a blocker. But for all intents and purposes, I think if the Jets are drafting Tyler Warren 7th overall, yeah, he's your starting tight end, but the most important role he has, he essentially becomes the number 2 guy in the passing game. I mean, I don't know if you can call him whatever you want. You call him the number 2 wide receiver if you want. He essentially would take the place as the number 2 guy, but he's the second guy in the second guy in the hierarchy in the passing game. I think that much would be clear. In a way, it's a positive because he would not need to be the guy the offense runs through right off the bat. And I think like the real bullish case for Tyler Warren is for him to eventually become like one of those handful of tight ends, maybe 5 or so in the NFL, who you could run a passing game through, but there would not be that pressure on him right off the bat because Garrett Wilson's on the team. I think no matter what happens with the Jets, no matter what they do in the NFL draft, Garrett Wilson will begin the season as the number 1 receiver. And that, could benefit Tyler Warren because, there would not be, it's a little different game planning for a wide receiver and a tight end, but Garrett Wilson's going to be the guy who draws the extra attention. Garrett Wilson's going to be the guy, teams roll coverage to, and Tyler Warren could benefit from that because he's not going to be, you can't really, even if we're talking a wide receiver and a tight end, it's difficult to double 2 guys. Back when the Chiefs had Tyreek Hill and Travis Kelce, that's one of the reasons they were so tough to defend is that, even though they technically play different positions, at the end of the day, you only have 5 receivers, and it's difficult for a defense to double both of them. So Warren would probably benefit from that standpoint. What would the hope be? I would guess, if you wanted to estimate it, I've actually researched this in the past. When we talk about wide receivers, if you have like 700 yards as a rookie, that's usually a very bullish sign. If you look at like what players who develop into Pro Bowlers as receivers produce as rookies, it generally is in like the 700-yard range. And then year two, they tend to increase their production after that. So I think I think you'd be looking for something that might be a little bit more on the modest side. I don't think you're looking for Warren to be a 1,000-yard guy. I don't think you're looking for him to have the Brock Bowers rookie year, or even if you go back to what Kyle Pitts did in 2021. Kyle Pitts went over 1,000 yards as a rookie. I don't think that would necessarily be the expectation, but I think he's a guy you would have to count on to contribute immediately because, when you draft a tight end is considered like a lower value position. And when you're talking about low value positions, if you're drafting somebody in the top 10, that means you have to be at the top. That means you have to be one of the elite players at your position eventually. And that means you need to make an immediate impact. There are other spots where, it's not as essential, like the example I gave earlier, where 21 wide receivers went over 1,000 yards last year, only 3 tight ends. So, you could be outside the top 20 at your position and still be an impact player at the receiver spot. At tight end, there really aren't that many impact guys. So I think, going forward, you'd certainly want Warren to be a guy who's consistently at least pushing for 1,000 yards. I think as a rookie, you're looking for immediate impact. You don't have the luxury of Warren just coming along slowly. You have the luxury of Warren coming along slowly from the standpoint that, he doesn't need to be a 1,000-yard guy right out of the gate, but he needs to be productive because Jets lack a number 2 receiver, right? Jets lack a number 2 option in the passing game right now. So they'd be looking for immediate impact as the 7th overall pick. If you're going to use the 7th overall pick on a tight end, it's got to be on a guy who helps you right away. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Thursday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.